The chauffeur was fired for theft, and the millionaire saw her watch. The same one he gave to his son before disappearing 21 years ago. Michael adjusted his tie nervously, glancing at the towering gates of the Reynolds estate. The grandeur of the property was intimidating, with its sprawling gardens and the stately mansion that seemed to stretch endlessly under the morning sun. It was his first day as Katherine Reynolds' personal chauffeur, and he was determined to make a good impression. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Whitmore, greeted him at the door. "You're late," she said curtly, even though Michael had arrived 15 minutes early, without waiting for his response. She handed him a neatly printed schedule. "Mrs. Reynolds values punctuality above all else. Do not forget that." Michael nodded, biting back a response. He followed Mrs. Whitmore to the garage, where a sleek black sedan gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Here she is," she said, gesturing to the car. "Keep it spotless. And remember, Mrs. Reynolds doesn't tolerate carelessness." Michael nodded again, running his hand over the polished surface of the vehicle. "Understood," he replied, his tone respectful but firm. Moments later, Katherine Reynolds appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Even from a distance, her presence commanded attention. Elegantly dressed in a tailored cream suit, she radiated a quiet confidence. Her gray-streaked auburn hair was neatly pinned back, accentuating her sharp features and piercing green eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Michael said, stepping forward to open the car door for her. She studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. "Good morning, Michael, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, Michael, let's see how well you handle the city's chaos. We have several appointments today." As they drove through the bustling streets, Katherine remained silent, her gaze fixed on the cityscape. Michael stole glances at her through the rearview mirror. Despite her composed exterior, there was a hint of melancholy in her expression, as if she carried the weight of a hidden sorrow. Their first stop was a high-end charity event at the city's art gallery. As Katherine exited the car, she turned to Michael. "Wait here. I'll call you when I'm ready." Michael watched as she disappeared into the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. Hours passed, and Michael busied himself by cleaning the already pristine interior of the car. When Katherine finally returned, she seemed weary, but maintained her poised demeanor. "Traffic's going to be a nightmare at this hour," she remarked as she settled into the back seat. "I'll find the fastest route." "Ma'am," Michael replied confidently. To Katherine's surprise, he navigated the congested streets with impressive skill, avoiding bottlenecks and weaving through side streets she hadn't known existed. By the time they arrived home, she regarded him with a touch of approval. "You handled that well." "Michael," she said, stepping out of the car. "Punctuality and competence. I appreciate that." "Thank you, ma'am," Michael replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Over the next few days, Michael's professionalism and calm demeanor began to earn Katherine's trust, unlike the other staff, who maintained a formal distance. Michael's sincerity set him apart. He listened attentively to Katherine's instructions and ensured every detail was perfect, whether it was timing her appointments or adjusting the temperature in the car to her liking. However, it wasn't just Katherine who noticed him. David, Katherine's much younger husband, had been observing Michael closely. At first, David dismissed him as just another employee, but as days turned into weeks, he grew increasingly wary. Katherine, who had always been reserved even with her staff, seemed unusually at ease in Michael's presence. One evening, as Michael waited outside the mansion after dropping Katherine off at an event, David approached him. "You're getting awfully comfortable here, aren't you?" David said, his tone laced with condescension. Michael looked up from polishing the car. "Just doing my job, sir," David smirked. "See that you remember your place?" Michael held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Of course, sir." David walked away, but the tension lingered. Michael could sense that David wasn't the type to let things go easily. Meanwhile, Katherine began to rely on Michael more, not just as a chauffeur, but as someone she could trust. On one particular drive, as the sun set over the city, she broke the usual silence. "Michael, do you have family?" she asked suddenly. Michael hesitated before answering. "Not anymore, ma'am. I grew up in foster care." Katherine glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her expression softening. "That must have been difficult." "It had its challenges," Michael admitted, "but I had good people along the way." Katherine nodded. Lost in thought, there was something about Michael that resonated with her. A quiet resilience, a strength born from adversity. As the days turned into weeks, Michael became an integral part of Katherine's routine. But under the surface, the tension with David continued to build. He watched Michael with growing suspicion, his charm masking a darker intent. For Michael, however, his focus remained on doing his job with integrity, unaware that he was walking into the center of a storm that would soon change everything. The grand dining room of the Reynolds mansion sparkled under the warm glow of an intricate crystal chandelier. Polished silverware gleamed atop a long mahogany table set for an intimate dinner. The scent of freshly cut roses filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of the gourmet meal being prepared in the kitchen. Katherine stood at the far end of the room, overseeing every detail of the setup. She wore an elegant navy gown, her poise and sharp eye reflecting her years of experience hosting gatherings for the elite. Across the room, David casually swirled a glass of red wine, leaning against the mantel of the ornate fireplace. "Darling," he said with a sly grin, "are we really putting on this much effort for the Lowells? They're hardly worth the vintage you've chosen." Katherine shot him a pointed look. "Appearances matter, David. You know that as well as I do." David smirked, but said nothing more, instead raising his glass in mock toast to her. Katherine turned away, muttering under her breath. Michael, standing quietly near the entrance, noticed the brief exchange. He'd grown accustomed to their tension, the way their words often carried undercurrents of unspoken grievances. Soon, the guests arrived, and the room filled with polite laughter and clinking glasses. The Lowells, a couple known for their substantial investments in the art world, took their places at the table. Katherine effortlessly transitioned into her role as hostess, her sharp wit and charm on full display. "Michael," she called softly from across the room, "could you bring the 2010 Bordeaux from the cellar, please?" "Yes, ma'am," Michael replied, slipping out of the room with practiced efficiency. As Michael descended into the cool, dimly lit cellar, he couldn't help but think about how Katherine transformed in the presence of guests. She was warm and engaging, a stark contrast to the quiet, contemplative woman he drove around during the day. It was as if she wore a mask, concealing the sorrow he glimpsed when she thought no one was watching. Returning with the bottle, Michael poured the wine with steady hands, listening to snippets of conversation as the guests discussed investments and travel plans. David, ever the charmer, leaned in close to Mrs. Lowell, his tone dripping with flattery. "Your recent acquisition from the Paris gallery is nothing short of genius," he said, his smile practiced and smooth. "Katherine and I were just discussing how your collection always sets the standard." Mrs. Lowell preened under the compliment, while Katherine's lips tightened into a thin line. She took a deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes flicking briefly to Michael, who stood unobtrusively by the doorway. Dinner progressed, and Michael remained in the background. Observing as the evening unfolded, he noticed the subtle ways David dominated the conversation, steering it toward his ventures and away from Katherine's achievements. Katherine, for her part, played along, though her smiles grew more forced as the night wore on. After dessert was served, the guests moved to the sitting room for brandy and cigars. Michael began clearing the table, his movements precise and efficient. As he reached for a silver tray, he overheard Katherine and David's voices drifting in from the adjacent room. "I saw the way you were fawning over Mrs. Lowell," Katherine said, her tone icy. "Oh, come now," David replied smoothly. "You know how these things work. A little charm goes a long way in securing future opportunities." "Opportunities for whom?" Katherine shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Because it certainly didn't feel like you were representing us." Michael paused, his hand hovering over the tray. He wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the tension between them was hard to ignore. "Don't be so dramatic, Katherine," David replied, his voice lowering into a warning tone. "It's unbecoming." There was a long silence before Katherine finally spoke again, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "Sometimes I wonder if I can even trust you." David laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Trust? That's rich, coming from you." Michael quickly resumed his task, not wanting to be caught in the middle of their exchange. By the time he finished clearing the table, the Lowells had departed, and the house had grown quiet. As Michael prepared to leave for the night, Katherine appeared at the door to the garage. She looked weary, the sparkle from earlier replaced by a shadow of exhaustion. "Thank you for tonight, Michael," she said softly. "You did well." "Of course, ma'am," he replied. "Let me know if there's anything else you need." Katherine hesitated, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than usual. "Good night, Michael." "Good night, ma'am." As she walked back toward the mansion, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her weariness than just the demands of the evening. And though Katherine carried herself with grace, Michael could sense the cracks beneath her polished exterior. Meanwhile, in the study, David poured himself another glass of whiskey, his jaw tightening as he stared at the flames in the fireplace. His mind raced, fueled by a growing frustration toward Katherine and his mounting suspicion of Michael. "He's getting too comfortable," David muttered to himself, his eyes narrowing, with a smirk that hinted at darker intentions. He took a slow sip of his drink. For David, the wheels of a new plan were already in motion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Reynolds estate as Michael polished the sleek black sedan in the garage. The rhythmic motion of the cloth against the car's surface allowed his mind to wander, replaying the events of the previous night. Katherine's exhaustion and David's veiled hostility lingered in his thoughts, unsettling him more than he cared to admit. Inside the mansion, David sat in his private office, a luxurious space lined with shelves of unread books and expensive trinkets. His polished exterior masked the storm brewing within. He stared at the security feed on his monitor, watching Michael work in the garage. "Too perfect," David muttered, tapping his fingers against the desk. "He's too perfect." His mind churned with suspicion. Michael's growing rapport with Katherine was a threat. Small now, but potentially disastrous. Katherine's wealth and influence were David's lifeline, and he wasn't about to let anyone jeopardize that. His lips curled into a cold smile as an idea began to take shape. By midday, Katherine had returned from a brief outing, her mood brighter than it had been the night before. Michael opened the car door for her as she stepped out, her hands full of shopping bags. "Thank you, Michael," she said warmly. "You're always so reliable." "Just doing my job, ma'am," Michael replied, his tone respectful but sincere, from the balcony above. David watched their interaction, his jaw tightening. He saw the way Katherine's shoulders relaxed in Michael's presence, the faint smile that lingered after she spoke to him. It was the kind of ease she rarely displayed around him anymore. Later that afternoon, David approached Katherine in the sunlit drawing room, where she was reviewing charity event plans. His tone was honeyed, but there was an edge to his words. "Katherine, darling, I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time with the help lately." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "If you're referring to Michael, he's been an excellent employee. He makes my life easier." David mused, feigning disinterest as he poured himself a glass of wine. "I just hope you're not mistaking professionalism for something more. You know how these people can be." Katherine's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you implying, David?" "Nothing at all," he replied smoothly, taking a sip of his drink. "Just a thought." Katherine didn't respond, but the tension between them thickened. David left the room, satisfied that his words had planted a seed of doubt. He needed Katherine to start questioning Michael, just enough to make his next move effective. That evening, as Michael prepared to leave for the day, David intercepted him near the garage. "Michael," he said, his voice unusually affable. "A moment, if you don't mind." Michael turned, surprised by David's tone. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" David smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted to thank you for your hard work. Katherine seems to speak very highly of you." "Thank you, sir. I do my best." Good, David said, nodding. "That's what I like to hear." He clapped Michael on the shoulder, his grip lingering just long enough to feel menacing. "Keep up the good work, Michael. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Michael met his gaze evenly, sensing the hidden threat. "Understood, sir." As Michael drove home that night, unease gnawed at him. David's words replayed in his mind, their underlying hostility impossible to ignore. The next morning, as Michael arrived for work, Mrs. Whitmore intercepted him at the gate, her expression unusually grim. "Michael," she said, lowering her voice, "there's been a situation." "What kind of situation?" he asked, his stomach tightening. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated before leading him to the security office. Inside, a uniformed guard stood by a table where a small black velvet pouch rested. Mrs. Whitmore gestured to the pouch. "Open it," she instructed. Michael's hands felt heavy as he untied the pouch. Inside were several glittering pieces of jewelry: diamond earrings, a sapphire bracelet, and a gold necklace. His heart sank. "I've never seen these before," he said firmly, looking between Mrs. Whitmore and the guard. "They were found in your locker," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her tone clipped. "I'm sorry, Michael, but we have to report this." Michael's protests fell on deaf ears as Mrs. Whitmore escorted him to Catherine's study. Catherine, who had been reading a report, looked up in confusion as they entered. "What's going on?" she asked, her gaze flicking to Michael and then to Mrs. Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore explained the situation, presenting the jewelry as evidence. Michael stood silently, his face pale but his posture defiant. "Catherine, I swear I didn't take those," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know how they got into my locker." Catherine's eyes searched his face, her expression conflicted. "Michael, this is serious." "I know it is," he replied. "But you know me. You know I wouldn't do something like this." Before Catherine could respond, David entered the room, feigning shock. "What's all this commotion?" When Mrs. Whitmore explained, David shook his head solemnly. "It's always the ones you least expect." Catherine shot him a sharp look, but said nothing. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Michael, I'm sorry, but until this is resolved, I have no choice but to let you go." Michael felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. He nodded stiffly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." As he walked out of the mansion for what he thought would be the last time, Catherine watched from the window, her heart heavy. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Then, as Michael approached his car, the sunlight caught the face of his watch. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The watch. It was unmistakable. The same antique timepiece she had given Ethan, her son, the day he disappeared. Catherine's heart raced as she watched Michael drive away from the mansion, the image of his watch etched in her mind. She could barely breathe. The antique timepiece, with its unique cracked face and gold etching, was impossible to mistake. It wasn't just a watch. It was Ethan's watch, her son's, the son she had lost 21 years ago. For a moment, the room spun, and she clutched the edge of the windowsill to steady herself. The memory of that day came rushing back. Ethan running through the garden, laughing, the sun glinting off the watch she had given him. And then, nothing. He was gone. No trace. Just silence and an empty void that had haunted her every waking moment since. "Catherine, are you all right?" David's voice broke through her thoughts, his concern so perfectly performed that it made her skin crawl. "I'm fine," she replied tersely, turning away from the window. She couldn't let him see her vulnerability. Not now. Not when something about this entire situation felt wrong. David tilted his head, studying her. "You look pale. Maybe you should rest. This whole situation with Michael, it's upsetting." "I know." Catherine forced a nod, her mind already racing. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. Michael sat on the edge of his worn couch in his modest apartment, his hands clenched into fists. The accusation had hit him harder than he cared to admit. Being called a thief wasn't just humiliating. It was a direct attack on his integrity, something he prided himself on. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Michael, it's Catherine." Her voice came through, firm but tinged with urgency. "Mrs. Reynolds," he replied, surprised. He had expected her to cut all ties after the events of the day. "I need to see you," she said. "There are things we need to discuss. Important things." Michael hesitated, the sting of his dismissal still fresh. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Michael, please," she insisted, her tone softening. "This isn't just about today, it's personal." The vulnerability in her voice caught him off guard. After a brief pause, he agreed, and they arranged to meet in a quiet cafe outside the city. When Michael arrived, Catherine was already seated at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of resolve and hesitation. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat down. Michael nodded, unsure of what to say. He waited for her to continue. Catherine took a deep breath. That watch you're wearing, where did you get it? Michael blinked, caught off guard by the question. It was my adoptive mom, he clarified. She gave it to me when I was a kid, said it was important. Do you know where she got it? Katherine pressed, her voice trembling slightly. Michael shook his head. She never said, just that it was the only thing she had when she found me. Katherine's breath hitched. Found you? Michael hesitated, sensing the weight of her question. I don't know much about it. I was abandoned as a kid. She told me she found me outside a hospital and took me in. Katherine's hands flew to her mouth, her mind spinning. The timeline, the watch. It all matched. But she needed certainty. She needed proof. Michael, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. I need you to do something for me. A DNA test. Michael froze, confusion flashing across his face. A DNA test, why? Because I believe you might be someone very important to me, she replied carefully, unwilling to reveal too much too soon. Michael stared at her, the pieces of the conversation clicking into place. Are you saying? I'm saying it's possible, Katherine interrupted gently. And if I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone. But if I'm right, then you deserve to know. Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always wondered about his past, but the possibility that this woman, his former employer, might hold the answers was almost too much to process. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. Back at the mansion, David's unease grew. Katherine had been distant all evening. Retreating to her study after her mysterious outing, he paced the length of their bedroom, trying to piece together what she was hiding. When she finally returned, he greeted her with feigned concern. Katherine, is everything okay? You've been so quiet tonight. She barely glanced at him. Just tired? It's been a long day. David forced a sympathetic smile, but his suspicions deepened. Katherine was hiding something, and whatever it was, it involved Michael. He was sure of it. Later that night, as Katherine slept, David crept into her study. The room was dark, but the faint glow of her computer screen provided enough light for him to see the papers strewn across her desk. Among them was a printout confirming an appointment at a private DNA testing lab. David's blood ran cold. What the hell is she doing? His eyes darted across the desk until they landed on a photograph tucked beneath the papers. A photo of Katherine with a young boy, no older than 8, wearing a familiar watch. David's jaw tightened as realization dawned. Ethan. The walls felt like they were closing in as David stood in the dim study. If Katherine was onto the truth, everything he had built, his life, his power, his access to her fortune, was at risk. He clenched his fists, a new plan forming in his mind. I won't let this happen, he muttered to himself, his voice a low growl. Not now, not ever. The following morning, Katherine awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The realization that Michael might be Ethan had reignited a fire within her that she hadn't felt in decades. As she dressed, her mind raced through the possibilities. If the DNA test confirmed her suspicions, she would finally have closure. But that closure could shatter everything she thought she knew about the life she had built since her son's disappearance. Downstairs, David sat at the breakfast table, his usual smirk plastered across his face. He watched Katherine enter, a glint of calculation in his eyes. Good morning, darling, he said smoothly, sipping his coffee. You seem energized today. Katherine gave him a curt nod. Just trying to stay focused. David raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. His suspicions about her activities only deepened as she avoided his gaze and left the room quickly, claiming she had errands to run. Meanwhile, Michael prepared himself for the meeting at the DNA testing lab. Despite agreeing to the test, doubt and unease lingered. The idea that his past could be tied to someone like Katherine Reynolds felt surreal. Growing up in foster care, he had learned not to dwell on questions about his origins. It only led to more pain. Yet, now that the opportunity to uncover the truth was within reach, he couldn't help but hope. The lab was a sterile, clinical space, its white walls devoid of personality. Katherine arrived first, clutching the file containing her medical records. She paced the waiting room, her heels clicking against the tile floor. When Michael entered, she stopped abruptly, her nerves momentarily forgotten. Michael, she greeted, her voice steadier than she felt. Thank you for coming. He nodded, his expression serious. Let's get this done." The process was straightforward. A swab from the inside of the cheek, a few signatures, and assurances from the technician that results would be ready in a matter of days. As they left the lab together, an awkward silence hung between them. Finally, Michael broke it. "If this comes back the way you think it will, what happens next?" Katherine hesitated, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "We'll figure it out together." Michael nodded, but his guarded expression remained. He wasn't ready to let himself believe in the possibility of a family. Not yet. Back at the mansion, David's unease had grown into outright paranoia. He couldn't ignore the signs. Katherine's secrecy, her sudden absences, the appointment at the lab. He needed to act, and he needed to act fast. Sitting in his office, he picked up his phone and made a call. "It's me," he said in a low voice. "I need you to dig into someone for me, Michael. No last name. Works as a chauffeur. I want everything you can find." He hung up, his mind racing. If Michael truly was Ethan, David knew the fallout would be catastrophic. Not just for his marriage, but for his entire existence. The fortune he had spent years securing would be at risk, and Katherine would never forgive him if she uncovered the truth about his involvement in Ethan's disappearance. The next 2 days were a blur for Katherine. She threw herself into work and charitable activities, trying to distract herself from the agonizing weight. But every quiet moment was filled with memories of Ethan. His laugh, his mischievous grin, the way he would hold her hand as they walked through the garden. When the email from the lab finally arrived, her heart pounded in her chest. She sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she opened the document. The words blurred together for a moment, her eyes scanning frantically until they landed on the result. 99.9% probability of a parent-child relationship. Tears streamed down her face as relief and heartbreak collided. It was him. Michael was Ethan. That evening, Katherine invited Michael to the mansion, insisting they talk in private. When he arrived, she led him to the study, her demeanor calm, but her emotions barely contained. "I got the results," she said, her voice wavering. Michael's jaw tightened. "And..." She handed him the printed document. He read it slowly, his eyes widening as the truth sank in. "You're my..." he began, his voice breaking. "Yes," Katherine said, stepping closer. "I'm your mother." The room fell silent as Michael processed the revelation. He felt a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, anger, disbelief, and beneath it all, a fragile sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what to say," he admitted finally. "You don't have to say anything right now," Katherine replied gently. "But I need you to know that I never stopped looking for you." "I never stopped hoping." Michael nodded, his walls beginning to crumble. "I don't remember much, just bits and pieces, but that watch. It's the only thing I ever had that felt important." Katherine reached for his hand, her voice breaking. "That watch was a gift from your father. It was meant to keep you connected to us." And it did. Unbeknownst to them, David stood outside the study, his ear pressed to the door. He had suspected the truth, but hearing it confirmed filled him with dread. Panic coursed through him as he realized his time was running out. Katherine would eventually piece everything together. His lies, his manipulation, and the role he had played in Ethan's disappearance. As Katherine and Michael embraced, David slipped away, his mind racing. He couldn't allow the truth to destroy everything he had built. He needed a new plan, something drastic. Katherine could barely focus on anything else after the revelation. Her mind was consumed by a mixture of joy and pain. Michael, Ethan, was alive, here, in front of her. But the circumstances of his disappearance loomed like a dark shadow. She had spent 2 decades mourning, clinging to fragments of hope, and now she was determined to uncover the truth. Michael, however, was more guarded. The revelation that Katherine was his mother had opened a wound he wasn't sure he could close. For years, he had accepted that he was abandoned, a child nobody wanted. Now, everything he thought he knew about himself was in question. "I'm sorry if this feels overwhelming," Katherine said softly as they sat in the study. "I can't imagine what you must be thinking." Michael nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "It's a lot to process," he admitted. "I don't know where to start." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Katherine assured him. "But I need you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Michael met her gaze. the sincerity in her eyes undeniable. "I want to know what happened," he said finally. "Why was I left behind? Why didn't you find me sooner?" Katherine's expression darkened. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I promise you I will find them. Someone took you from me, Ethan, and I will find out who." Michael flinched slightly at the name. Ethan. It felt foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. But he didn't correct her. Part of him wanted to reclaim it, to understand the life he had lost. David, meanwhile, was spiraling. Alone in his office, he poured himself another glass of whiskey, his hand shaking slightly. Katherine's words echoed in his mind. Someone took you from me. The walls of his carefully constructed life were beginning to crumble, and he knew it was only a matter of time before Katherine's investigation led back to him. He had underestimated her resolve, assuming that the years of grief would leave her too weary to pursue the truth. Now, her determination was a direct threat to his survival. David picked up his phone and dialed a number. "I need an update," he said sharply. "What do you have on Michael?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "Not much, sir. He's clean. No criminal record, no debts, just a regular guy." David cursed under his breath. "That's not good enough. Keep digging. There has to be something." "Yes, sir," the voice replied before the line went dead. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He needed a new plan, one that would neutralize Michael and keep Katherine from uncovering the full extent of his betrayal. Katherine didn't waste time. The next morning, she contacted a private investigator she had worked with years ago during her initial search for Ethan. The man, a grizzled veteran named Frank Marshall, had a reputation for being relentless. "I need your help again, Frank," Katherine said as they sat in her study. Frank leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "It's been a long time, Katherine. What's changed?" "I found him," she said, her voice trembling. "My son, Ethan." Frank's eyebrows shot up. "You're sure?" She handed him the DNA results. "There's no doubt, but I need to know what happened to him. Why he disappeared. Who was responsible?" Frank nodded, his demeanor turning serious. "All right, where do we start?" Katherine hesitated before answering. "David." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Your husband?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I don't have proof yet, but I've always had my suspicions. He was so insistent that we stopped looking for Ethan, so quick to accept that he was gone. I didn't want to believe it at the time. But now," Frank scribbled notes in a small leather notebook. "I'll see what I can find. But if he's as slippery as you think, this won't be easy." "I don't care how long it takes," Katherine said. "I need the truth." Michael returned to the mansion that evening. At Katherine's request, she had insisted they have dinner together, just the two of them, to begin rebuilding their relationship as they ate in the smaller dining room, a cozy space far removed from the grandeur of the main hall. Katherine shared stories about Ethan's childhood. "You loved the garden," she said, her voice warm with nostalgia. "You would spend hours out there, chasing butterflies and picking flowers for me." Michael smiled faintly. "I wish I could remember. It sounds nice." Katherine reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "We'll make new memories, I promise," before Michael could respond. The door to the dining room opened, and David entered, his face carefully neutral. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed his irritation. "Actually, you are," Katherine replied coldly. "Michael and I are having a private dinner." David ignored her, turning his attention to Michael. "You're back so soon I didn't think we'd see you again after... well, you know." Michael's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Katherine stood, her posture rigid. "David, leave," she said, her voice firm. "This is not your concern." David smirked, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Of course. Darling, enjoy your dinner." As he left the room, Katherine's resolve only strengthened. She could no longer deny the truth. David was hiding something, and she was going to uncover it, no matter the cost. Katherine sat in her study long after Michael had left, staring at the DNA results. The paper in her hands was proof of a miracle she had stopped believing in years ago. But alongside the joy of finding Ethan, now Michael, came a growing unease. The puzzle pieces of his disappearance didn't fit together neatly, and one central figure loomed large in her suspicions. David, her husband, had been in her life when Ethan vanished. At the time, David had been charming, attentive, and eager to step into the role of a supportive partner during her grief. But now, with the clarity that distance and time offered, she began to remember the cracks in his facade, his insistence on ending searches, the way he comforted her but never seemed genuinely devastated. Those memories gnawed at her. The next morning, Frank Marshall called with his first report. Katherine listened intently as his gruff voice came through the speakerphone. "I did some digging into David's movements back then," Frank said. "There's not much. He was careful. But I found something interesting right around the time Ethan disappeared. David withdrew a large sum of cash. No clear reason why." Katherine's grip on the phone tightened. "And it gets murkier. He was in contact with someone named James Bell, a name that doesn't show up in any of his official dealings. I'm looking into who Bell is, but it's taking time." Katherine leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. "Frank, keep digging. Whatever it takes." "Will do," Frank replied. "But Katherine, you need to prepare yourself. If David's involved, this could get ugly." Katherine swallowed hard. "I'm ready for the truth, no matter what it is." Michael, meanwhile, struggled with the weight of the revelation. His entire life had been upended in the span of a few days. Though Katherine had shown him nothing but kindness, he found it difficult to reconcile the idea of her as his mother. His memories were fragmented, flashes of laughter and safety that felt more like dreams than reality. He spent his free time at his modest apartment, poring over old keepsakes his adoptive mother had left behind. Among the faded photos and trinkets, the watch stood out, a constant reminder of the connection he now shared with Katherine. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, but a part of him remained wary. Trust didn't come easily after a lifetime of learning to fend for himself. At the mansion, David was growing increasingly anxious. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead, but Katherine's renewed focus on Ethan's disappearance had thrown him off balance. Her distant demeanor and private meetings were signs he couldn't ignore. Late one night, he slipped into Katherine's study. The room smelled faintly of lavender and paper, and the dim glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows. He rifled through her desk drawers, careful not to disturb anything. Among the neatly organized files, he found a folder labeled Ethan. Inside were photos, handwritten notes, and a copy of the DNA results. David's heart pounded as he scanned the document. 99.9% probability of a parent-child relationship. The words hit him like a blow. Katherine had found him. Found Ethan. Damn it. David muttered under his breath, his mind racing. If Katherine knew the truth about Michael, it was only a matter of time before she uncovered everything else. He couldn't let that happen. The next day, Katherine met Michael for lunch at a small cafe in the city. She had hoped to create a more casual environment, one that might help ease the tension between them. Michael arrived looking slightly uncomfortable, his usual calm demeanor strained. "Thank you for coming," Katherine said as he sat down. "I know this has been a lot." Michael nodded. "That's an understatement." Katherine smiled softly, trying to bridge the gap between them. "I thought it might help if we talked. If there's anything you want to ask me, anything you want to know, I'm here." Michael hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. I just don't understand why this is happening now. Why didn't you find me sooner?" Katherine's expression faltered. "I tried, Michael, for years. I tried. But the trail went cold. And I was surrounded by people who told me to move on. To let go." "David?" Michael asked, his tone cautious. Katherine hesitated before nodding. "Yes, he was supportive at first, but eventually, he convinced me there was no hope. I wanted to believe him because it was easier than facing the pain every day." Michael leaned back, absorbing her words. "And now, what changed?" "You," Katherine said simply. "You walked into my life, and everything I thought I knew changed. I can't explain it, but the moment I saw that watch, I knew there was something there, and now I know why." Michael looked down, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. "I don't know how to be what you want me to be. I don't want you to be anything other than who you are," Katherine said, her voice firm. "But I do want to give us a chance to figure this out, together." As Katherine returned to the mansion that afternoon, her resolve strengthened. She couldn't let David continue to manipulate her life. She had allowed herself to be blinded by grief and desperation for too long now. With Michael back in her life, she was determined to confront the past and expose the truth. But David was already preparing his next move. In his office, he made another call, his tone low and menacing. "Belle, it's time. We need to make sure this problem disappears. For good." Catherine's suspicions deepened with every passing day. David's demeanor had shifted noticeably. He was quieter, more watchful, and his frequent disappearances from the mansion did little to quell her unease. If Frank was right about David's connection to James Bell, then she was dealing with a conspiracy that stretched back decades. Frank Marshall arrived at the mansion early that morning, a worn leather briefcase in hand. His presence was deliberate. Katherine wanted David to know she wasn't backing down. As Frank stepped into her study, Katherine shut the door behind him. "What do you have?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. Frank opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. "I dug deeper into James Bell. Turns out, he's not just some nobody. He's a fixer, someone who handles problems for people with deep pockets. He's been linked to several disappearances, all conveniently tied to wealthy clients." Katherine felt a chill run down her spine. And his connection to David. Frank pulled out a grainy photo taken at a restaurant 2 decades earlier. In the foreground sat David, his face unmistakable, shaking hands with a man who looked every bit the part of a shady operator. "This was taken 3 weeks after Ethan disappeared," Frank said grimly. "Bell was in town for 2 days. After that, he vanished." Katherine stared at the photo, her stomach twisting. "It's him," she whispered. "David lied to me all these years." Frank nodded. "I'd bet my career on it. But if you're going to confront him, you'll need more than this. Bell's still alive, and if we can get to him, we might have a chance at getting a confession." Across town, Michael stood in the doorway of his small apartment, staring at Katherine's watch. It had become an anchor in his storm of emotions, a tangible link to the mother he was still struggling to accept. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. "Michael," Katherine's voice came through, calm but insistent. "I need you to come to the mansion. There's something you need to hear." "What is it?" he asked, already sensing the tension in her tone. "Just come," she said. "You'll understand when you're here." Michael agreed reluctantly, his gut telling him that whatever Katherine had to say, it would change everything. David had been in his office when Frank arrived at the mansion, and the sight of the private investigator strolling through the gates had sent his paranoia into overdrive. He watched from the window, gripping the edge of his desk as Katherine welcomed the man into her study. "Damn it," David muttered, pacing the room. He grabbed his phone and dialed James Bell. "This is getting out of control," David hissed. "Katherine's on to us. She brought in a private investigator." "Calm down," Bell replied, his voice as smooth as ever. "You panicking isn't going to help. You don't understand. She's not going to stop." "Then we make sure she doesn't have the chance to dig any deeper," Bell said, his tone darkening. "You've got one shot at this, David. Do it right." David hung up, his chest heaving. If Katherine found out the truth, it would destroy him. He needed to act now. Michael arrived at the mansion later that afternoon, greeted by a visibly tense Katherine. She led him into her study. Where Frank was waiting, Michael raised an eyebrow at the stranger but said nothing as Katherine closed the door. "Michael, this is Frank Marshall," Katherine began. "He's a private investigator I've been working with." Michael nodded cautiously. "Okay, and what does that have to do with me?" Frank leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "It's not just about you, son. It's about what happened to you." Michael frowned, his arms crossing defensively. "What are you talking about?" Katherine took a deep breath. "Michael, I think David had something to do with your disappearance. Frank's found evidence linking him to a man named James Bell, someone who specializes in making people disappear." Michael's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "David, your husband, why would he—" "For my money," Katherine interrupted, her voice trembling. "It was always about the money. David married me for my fortune, and with Ethan out of the picture, he knew he would gain more control." Michael stared at her, his jaw tightening. "And you're only figuring this out now." "I was blinded by grief," Katherine admitted, her voice breaking. "I wanted so badly to believe that Ethan was gone because of some accident. Not because someone I trusted could do this. Michael turned away, pacing the room as he processed the revelation. So, what now? What are you going to do? Frank spoke up. We need to find Bell. If we can get him to talk, we'll have enough to bring David down. Michael nodded slowly. And what happens if we can't? Catherine's eyes hardened. Then I'll handle David myself. As dusk settled over the mansion, David made his move. Under the guise of taking a business call, he slipped out of the house and drove to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Bell was waiting for him, leaning casually against the hood of his car. You're late, Bell said, lighting a cigarette. I had to make sure no one noticed, David snapped. We need to act now. Catherine's getting too close. Bell exhaled a plume of smoke, his expression unreadable. You sure you're ready for this? There's no going back. David hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. Just tell me what I need to do. Bell nodded, his cold smile sending a chill down David's spine. Leave it to me. By the time I'm done, there won't be anything left for her to find. The morning air was tense at the Reynolds mansion, thick with an unspoken unease. Katherine sat in her study, her hands clasped tightly as she stared at the scattered documents on her desk. The photo of David and James Bell haunted her thoughts. Her grip on the truth was growing firmer, but so was the danger that came with it. Michael arrived early, responding to Catherine's request for another meeting. He found her in the study, her usual composed demeanor replaced with a weary intensity. Frank Marshall was already there, pacing the room with a grim expression. Morning, Michael said cautiously as he stepped inside. What's going on? Katherine motioned for him to sit. We've uncovered more about David, and about the man who might have taken you, James Bell. Michael frowned, his jaw tightening. You're saying he hired someone to get rid of me? Frank nodded, his tone blunt. That's exactly what we're saying. Bell's got a history of handling problems for rich people who want their hands clean. David fits the profile. Michael leaned back, a storm of emotions crossing his face. If that's true, why am I still alive? Why didn't this guy finish the job? Frank exchanged a glance with Katherine before answering. That's the part we don't know. Maybe something went wrong. Maybe Bell didn't follow through. Either way, it's time to get some answers. Across town, David sat in a dimly lit cafe, his nerves fraying with every second. James Bell slid into the booth across from him, his movements calm and calculated. He looked every bit the professional fixer, unassuming but with an air of danger. This better be good, Bell said, lighting a cigarette. I don't usually do face-to-face. David leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper. Catherine's closing in. She brought in a private investigator. He's digging through everything. Bell exhaled a plume of smoke, his expression unmoved. And, David hissed. She's going to figure it out. She's already putting pieces together, if she links me to you. Bell cut him off with a sharp laugh. Relax. She's not going to find anything. You paid me well to make sure of that, remember? David's hand trembled as he gripped his coffee cup. I can't afford for this to blow up in my face. Do something. Bell tilted his head, studying David like a predator sizing up its prey. You're panicking. That's the first mistake. If you want me to clean this up, it's going to cost extra. David's face twisted in frustration. Fine, just handle it. Bell's cold smile returned. Consider it done. Back at the mansion, Katherine worked with Frank to finalize their next steps. She had instructed him to focus all his efforts on tracking down Bell and gathering enough evidence to confront David. But as the hours passed, a gnawing sense of dread settled over her. She knew David too well. He wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, Katherine and Michael shared dinner in the smaller dining room. It had become their safe space, far from the grandeur of the main halls where David's presence loomed like a dark cloud. You've been quiet, Katherine said gently, watching Michael push his food around his plate. Michael sighed, setting his fork down. It's hard to process all these years, I thought. I was abandoned. But now, knowing someone took me, someone who wanted me gone, it's a lot. Katherine reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. I can't change what happened, Michael, but I swear to you, I will make this right. Before Michael could respond, the door opened and David stepped inside. His sudden appearance sent a ripple of tension through the room. Am I interrupting? David asked, his tone overly casual. "Yes," Katherine said curtly, her eyes narrowing. "What do you need?" David smiled thinly, ignoring her hostility. "I was just wondering why our dear Michael seems to be spending so much time here. You're not still upset about the whole misunderstanding with the jewelry, are you?" Michael's eyes flashed with anger, but Katherine spoke before he could. "This isn't your concern, David. Please leave." David raised his hands in mock surrender. "Of course. Enjoy your dinner." As he left, Katherine's resolve hardened. She couldn't let David continue to manipulate her life. It was time to take control. Later that night, David slipped into the garage where Michael's car was parked. He moved quickly, his hands steady as he planted a small device under the dashboard. Satisfied, he stepped back, his face a mask of cold determination. The next morning, Michael prepared to leave the mansion after another tense meeting with Katherine. As he started his car, a strange sound caught his attention. A faint, rhythmic beeping. He froze, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. He stepped out of the car and crouched down, searching for the source of the noise. His heart nearly stopped when he spotted the small device attached to the undercarriage. It was a tracker. Michael straightened, his mind racing. Someone was watching him, but who and why? Without hesitation, he removed the device and slipped it into his pocket. He needed to figure out who was behind it, and fast. That evening, Katherine called Frank with an update. "David's up to something," she said, her voice firm. "I can feel it." Frank's voice was calm but serious. "I've got a lead on Belle. I'll follow up tomorrow. In the meantime, watch your back." "I always do," Katherine replied. But as she hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was closing in, and they were running out of time. The following morning dawned gray and ominous, the heavy clouds mirroring Katherine's mood. She sat at the head of the dining table, her coffee untouched, staring out the large windows overlooking the estate. Frank's progress on James Bell was promising, but the pressure of waiting for answers was taking its toll. David entered the room, as polished as ever in his tailored suit. His charm, usually a weapon of disarming ease, only grated on Katherine now. "You look troubled," he said, sitting across from her. "Everything all right?" Katherine barely glanced at him. "Just thinking. Care to share?" David's tone was light, but his eyes betrayed his curiosity. "I'd rather not," Katherine replied curtly, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. David smirked faintly, but inside, his nerves were fraying. Katherine's distance was a sign that she was piecing things together. He needed to act quickly. Across town, Frank Marshall parked outside a modest suburban home. He had finally tracked down James Bell, whose low profile was carefully maintained but not impenetrable. Armed with years of experience and a knack for reading people, Frank approached the door. Bell answered after several knocks, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Frank. "Who the hell are you?" "Frank Marshall," he said, holding up a badge. "Private investigator, I'd like to talk." Bell chuckled dryly. "I don't do interviews. This one might be worth your time," Frank replied smoothly. "It's about Katherine Reynolds and the boy you helped disappear 21 years ago." Bell stiffened, his easy demeanor vanishing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," Frank said, stepping closer. "But if I start digging deeper, I'm bound to find someone who does. Or maybe I just go to the authorities." Bell hesitated, his eyes darting to the street. "Fine, 5 minutes." Frank followed him inside, his senses on high alert. Bell sat on a worn couch, his movements tense. "You worked for David Reynolds," Frank began, skipping the pleasantries. "He hired you to get rid of Ethan Reynolds. What happened?" Bell's jaw tightened. "I don't work for free. If you want answers, you're going to have to pay." Frank smirked. "I think you're in enough trouble as it is. If you cooperate, maybe I don't bring this to the police." Bell cursed under his breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine, yes. I worked for David. He said the kid was in the way. Told me to make it look like an accident. And," Frank pressed, "I couldn't go through with it," Bell admitted, his voice low. "I left the boy outside a hospital. Figured someone would find him. He'd live, and I'd still get paid." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Did David know you didn't finish the job?" Bell nodded reluctantly. "I told him. He wasn't happy, but he paid me off to keep my mouth shut." Frank leaned back, his mind racing. "You realize you just confessed to kidnapping, right?" Bell shrugged. "Statute of limitations," Frank smirked. "Not on crimes involving kids." Bell's face paled. "What do you want from me?" "Testify," Frank said. "We need to bring David down." Bell hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but if he finds out, I'm dead." "Leave that to me," Frank said, standing. "Stay close. I'll be in touch." At the mansion, Katherine and Michael sat in the study, their conversation strained. Michael had told her about the tracker he found on his car, and the implications were impossible to ignore. "He's trying to keep tabs on me," Michael said, pacing the room. "Why, what's his endgame?" Katherine shook her head, her heart sinking. David's always been calculating, but this is something else. The door burst open suddenly, and David strode in, his expression a perfect blend of anger and feigned confusion. "What's this about you accusing me of planting a tracker on your car?" David demanded, his gaze locked on Michael. Michael stiffened, his fists clenching. "How would you know about that unless it was you?" David scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself," Katherine told me. Katherine stood, her voice firm. "I didn't tell you anything, David." The tension in the room was electric, and for the first time, David's composure cracked. His smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. "Are you accusing me of something, Katherine?" he asked, his voice colder now. "I don't need to accuse you of anything," Katherine said, her eyes blazing. "The truth is coming, David, and when it does, you'll answer for everything," David sneered, his mask of charm completely gone. "You think you're so clever, but you don't know what you're dealing with." "Neither do you," Katherine replied, her voice calm but unyielding. "This is over, David. You just don't realize it yet." David stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Katherine sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. Michael stepped closer, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I will be," Katherine replied, her resolve hardening. "We're going to end this, Michael. Together." That night, David made one last desperate call to Bell. "We have a problem," he growled. "Katherine knows everything. Fix it." Bell hesitated on the other end, his earlier conversation with Frank replaying in his mind. "I'm out, David. This is too hot." "You don't get to walk away," David shouted. "Watch me," Bell replied coldly, ending the call. David threw the phone against the wall, his world unraveling around him. He knew his options were running out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect himself. The morning after David's outburst, Katherine was already in her study, flipping through the mountain of evidence Frank had provided. Each piece painted a darker picture of David's deceit and betrayal. The photo of him and James Bell was damning, but the revelation that Bell had abandoned Ethan at a hospital added a layer of anguish Katherine wasn't prepared for. She couldn't stop imagining her little boy, scared and alone, waiting for someone to rescue him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice tight. Michael entered, his expression serious. "Frank just called. He says he has something important." Katherine nodded, her heart racing. "Let's not waste any time." At Frank's small office in the city, Katherine and Michael sat across from the investigator, who looked more determined than ever. He placed a recorder on the desk between them, pressing play without a word. James Bell's gravelly voice crackled through the speaker. "David Reynolds hired me to get rid of Ethan. Said the kid was in his way and that it needed to look like an accident." Katherine's breath hitched as the recording continued. "I couldn't do it," Bell confessed. "Left the boy at a hospital instead. Figured he'd be better off. David wasn't happy, but he paid me to keep quiet." Frank paused the recording, his gaze fixed on Katherine. "This is enough to bring David down. With Bell willing to testify, there's no way he can worm his way out of this." Katherine leaned back, her emotions a whirlwind of relief and fury. "What happens now?" "We go to the authorities," Frank said firmly. "But you need to be ready. David's not going to take this lying down." Katherine nodded, her resolve hardening. "I've been ready for 21 years. That afternoon, back at the mansion, David paced his office, the walls closing in on him. He had spent years crafting a perfect facade, but it was slipping away faster than he could control. The failed call to Bell the previous night had been a clear message. He was on his own. He poured himself a drink, the whiskey doing little to calm his nerves. His mind raced with desperate plans, each more reckless than the last. He needed leverage, something to turn the tables on Katherine and keep himself in the clear. Katherine and Michael returned to the mansion as dusk settled, their nerves frayed but their determination unwavering. Frank had advised them to stay alert. David would inevitably sense the walls closing in, and he was bound to lash out. Michael followed Katherine into the study, where they sat in tense silence. Finally, Michael spoke. "How do you want to do this?" he asked, his voice low. "We confront him," Katherine said firmly. "But not until the authorities are ready to act. Frank's handling that." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "And if David tries something before then?" Katherine looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "Then we're ready." Unbeknownst to them, David was already making his move, slipping out of the mansion under the cover of darkness. He drove to a nearby storage unit he had rented under a false name. Inside, he rummaged through a collection of old files and documents, his hands trembling. He found what he was looking for, a stack of forged financial documents implicating Katherine in illegal dealings. The papers were fabricated years ago as a contingency plan, a way to shift blame if his schemes ever came to light. Now, they were his last hope. "If she wants a war," he muttered to himself, "I'll give her one." The next morning, Katherine woke to find a courier envelope waiting on the doorstep. She opened it cautiously, her heart sinking as she read the contents. The forged documents painted her as the mastermind behind fraudulent financial schemes. Complete with fake signatures and detailed accounts, Michael entered the room, alarmed by her pale expression. "What is it?" She handed him the papers, her voice trembling. "David's trying to frame me." Michael's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents. "He's desperate. These are too clean, too perfect. No one's going to believe this." "It doesn't matter if they're believable," Katherine said, her voice steadier now. "He's buying himself time. He knows we're close." Michael set the papers down, his jaw clenched. "Then we don't give him that time. We need to finish this." Later that day, Frank called with an update. "I've spoken to the DA," he said. "They're willing to move forward, but we need to catch David in the act. If he's desperate, he's bound to make a mistake." Katherine exhaled slowly, her mind already racing with possibilities. "What do you need from me?" "Keep him close," Frank replied. "Let him think he still has the upper hand. The more confident he feels, the more likely he is to slip." Katherine nodded, her resolve firm. "Consider it done." That evening, Katherine hosted a dinner, inviting several close associates and friends, including Michael, who remained by her side. David, unaware of the trap being set, played his part flawlessly, charming the guests with his wit and charisma. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Katherine watched him carefully, noting every movement, every glance. She could see the cracks forming in his veneer, the nervous energy, the slightly too wide smile as the evening wore on. Katherine leaned in close to Michael. "It's almost time," she whispered. Michael nodded, his eyes locked on David. "Let's end this." The grand dining room buzzed with polite conversation and the clinking of glasses as Katherine's carefully orchestrated dinner party unfolded. The guests, a mix of business associates, longtime friends, and influential figures, filled the room with an air of sophistication. But beneath the veneer of civility, the tension between Katherine and David simmered like a storm waiting to break. Michael, seated near the end of the table, kept his eyes on David, his instincts on high alert. He could sense the subtle shifts in David's demeanor, the forced laughter, the restless tapping of his fingers against his glass. It was a performance, one that Michael was certain wouldn't last the night. Katherine, however, was calm and deliberate. She moved through the evening with practiced ease, engaging her guests while keeping a sharp eye on David. This was her battlefield, and she intended to control every moment. As the main course was cleared, Katherine stood, raising her glass to signal a toast. The room quieted as all eyes turned to her. "Thank you all for joining me tonight," she began, her voice warm but firm. "It's always a pleasure to be surrounded by such esteemed company." David smiled, raising his own glass. To Katherine, the perfect hostess. A ripple of laughter passed through the room, but Katherine's gaze remained locked on him. She set her glass down, her tone shifting. "While we're here, she continued. "I think it's time to address something important." The room grew quieter, the shift in her tone catching everyone's attention. David's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Katherine," he said lightly, "perhaps now isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Katherine interrupted, her voice steady. "There's a truth that needs to be brought to light, and I believe this is the perfect audience for it." David's knuckles whitened as he gripped his glass. "What are you talking about?" Katherine motioned to Michael, who stood and walked to her side. The room murmured, the sight of Katherine and her former chauffeur standing together a curious sight. Katherine took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room before settling on David. "This is Michael," she began. "Some of you may know him as my former chauffeur, but what you don't know is that Michael is my son, Ethan." The room gasped in unison, the revelation landing like a bombshell. David's face paled, his mask of composure slipping. "This is absurd," David sputtered, his voice tinged with desperation. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the son you tried to take from me," Katherine said, her voice rising. "The boy you had kidnapped, thinking it would secure your control over my life and my fortune." The murmurs in the room grew louder, shock and disbelief rippling through the crowd. David laughed nervously, shaking his head. "You can't be serious," he said. "This is some wild fantasy." "I have proof," Katherine snapped, her voice cutting through the room. She motioned to Frank, who stepped forward from the shadows, holding a folder of documents. Frank placed the folder on the table, his expression grim. "This contains everything: testimonies, financial records, and communications linking you to James Bell. He's already agreed to testify." David's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "This is a setup," he shouted. "Katherine, you're letting these people manipulate you." Katherine stepped closer, her voice cold. "No, David. The only manipulation here is yours. You stole my son. You lied to me for 21 years. And now, it's over." Michael stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "You almost ruined my life," he said, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. "But you didn't win." David's composure cracked completely. "You're nothing but a pawn," he spat at Michael. "You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for my decisions." Katherine raised her hand, silencing the room. "Enough," she said, her tone final. She turned to Frank. "Call them." Frank nodded, stepping out of the room. Moments later, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. 2 police officers entered, their presence commanding silence. "David Reynolds," one of them said. "You're under arrest." David's face contorted with fury and desperation. "You can't do this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Katherine met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I've waited too long for justice." The officer stepped forward, placing handcuffs on David as the room watched in stunned silence. He struggled, shouting accusations and threats, but the fight had left his voice hollow. As the officers led him away, Katherine turned to her guests. "I apologize for the disturbance," she said calmly, but the truth needed to come out. The guests remained silent, their expressions a mix of shock and respect. One by one, they began to leave, murmuring words of support and disbelief as they passed. Later that night, Katherine and Michael sat together in the study, the house quiet for the first time in what felt like years. The weight of the evening hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of relief. "It's over," Michael said softly. Katherine nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's over." For the first time, she allowed herself to exhale, the years of pain and uncertainty finally lifting. Michael reached for her hand, and they sat in silence, letting the reality of their newfound bond settle in. The mansion was eerily quiet the morning after David's arrest. The echoes of the previous night's confrontation still lingered in Katherine's mind, replaying like a broken record. She sat in her study, the morning light filtering through the curtains, illuminating the scattered documents on her desk. Despite the victory, a deep ache settled in her chest. 21 years, years stolen from her and Ethan, could never be reclaimed. Michael found her there, staring blankly at the papers. He hesitated at the door, unsure whether to interrupt her solitude. Finally, he spoke. "Good morning." Katherine looked up, forcing a faint smile. "Good morning," He stepped inside, hands in his pockets. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel lighter, but the weight of everything is still here." Michael nodded, understanding her unspoken words. "It's not easy to move past something like this." Katherine motioned for him to sit across from her. "How about you? How are you feeling?" Michael shrugged, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. I've spent most of my life not knowing where I came from, who I was, and now I have answers, but it's a lot to take in." Katherine reached across the desk, her hand covering his. "We'll figure it out, together." Michael gave her a small nod, but the uncertainty in his eyes lingered. Later that day, Katherine ventured into the garden, seeking solace in the familiar surroundings. The roses Ethan had loved as a child were still there, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray clouds looming overhead. She trailed her fingers over the petals, memories flooding her mind. She could almost hear his laughter, see his small hands clutching a bouquet he'd picked for her. The weight of the lost years pressed down on her, threatening to overwhelm her composure. Frank's voice broke through her thoughts. "I thought I might find you out here." She turned, offering him a faint smile. "You've always known where to look." Frank approached, his expression gentle. "How are you holding up?" "Better now," she replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Frank nodded, standing beside her. "You did what most people wouldn't have had the strength to do. You stood up to him." "I didn't have a choice," Katherine said quietly. "I couldn't let him get away with what he did." Frank hesitated before speaking again. "Bells agreed to testify. The case against David is airtight. There's no way he's walking away from this." Katherine exhaled slowly, the weight of relief mingling with the pain of the past. "Good. He deserves every consequence. And you deserve peace," Frank said firmly. Katherine smiled faintly. "I'm working on it." Michael spent the afternoon in his apartment, sorting through the few belongings he had left from his adoptive mother. Among the items was a faded photograph of the two of them, smiling in front of a small house. She had been his rock, the one constant in a life full of uncertainty. But now, a new reality was unfolding. A mother he had never known, but who had never stopped searching for him. He felt torn, caught between the past he had accepted and the future he was still learning to trust. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Katherine stood there, holding a small box. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. Michael stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Not at all. What's that?" Katherine set the box on the small table in his living room. "I thought you might want these. They're some of your things from when you were a child." Michael stared at the box, hesitant to open it. "You kept them." "Of course," Katherine said softly. "I couldn't bring myself to let them go." Michael lifted the lid, his breath catching as he sifted through the contents. A small toy truck, a stuffed animal missing one button eye, and a handful of crayon drawings stared back at him. His fingers brushed against a framed photo of himself as a young boy, grinning beside Katherine. "That was the last picture we took together," Katherine said, her voice trembling. "It was your 8th birthday." Michael swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to spill over. "I don't remember much, but I think I remember this." Katherine smiled through her tears. "I hope we can make new memories, ones we won't have to recover in fragments." Michael nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too." That evening, Katherine returned to the mansion, leaving Michael with the box of memories. She settled into her study, her thoughts drifting to the years ahead. For the first time in decades, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been lost. But as she stared at the empty chair across from her desk, the weight of David's betrayal resurfaced. His actions had stolen so much from her, from them, and the scars would take time to heal. As the house grew quiet, Katherine made a silent vow. She would not let the pain of the past define their future. They had a second chance, and she intended to make every moment count. The days following David's arrest were filled with a quiet, yet heavy sense of transition. The Reynolds mansion, once a place of power, plays, and secrets, now carried the promise of healing. Katherine focused on restoring a sense of normalcy. Though the emptiness left by David's absence lingered like a shadow, the house felt quieter without his dominating presence. But that quiet brought space for something new. Reconnection. Michael arrived at the mansion mid-morning, parking his car in the expansive driveway. He hesitated before stepping out, the sheer size and grandeur of the place still overwhelming him. He had spent so much of his life in modest surroundings that the vast halls and perfectly manicured lawns felt foreign, almost intimidating. Katherine greeted him at the door, her smile warm and genuine. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "I have something I'd like to show you." Michael followed her into the library, a space he hadn't seen before. The room was lined with towering bookshelves, their contents meticulously organized. A large desk sat by the window, sunlight streaming onto its polished surface. On the desk was an album, its leather cover worn but well preserved. Katherine gestured for him to sit as she opened the album. "I thought it might be time for you to see this." The first page held a photo of Michael as a baby, swaddled in a soft blanket. His mother's younger self smiled down at him, her eyes filled with joy and promise. "This was the day we brought you home from the hospital," Katherine said softly. "You were so small, but you had this fierce little cry. It was like you were determined to make your presence known." Michael chuckled despite himself. "Sounds about right." Katherine flipped through the pages, showing him snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and quiet moments in the garden. Each image was a fragment of a life he barely remembered, but seeing them brought a strange sense of comfort. "I kept this album with me through everything," Katherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was my way of holding on to you when I couldn't find you." Michael nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you for keeping this, for not giving up." "I never could," Katherine replied, reaching for his hand. "Even when everyone told me to move on, I couldn't let go of the hope that you were out there." Later that afternoon, Michael joined Katherine in the garden. It was a space that seemed to embody her resilience, every flower carefully tended, despite the chaos that had touched her life. Michael helped her trim the roses, their vibrant petals reminding him of the drawings he had found in the box she'd given him. "I used to love this garden," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "I don't remember much, but I remember the colors." Katherine smiled, her hands moving deftly among the thorns. "You used to spend hours out here, making up stories about the flowers. You said the roses were soldiers, and the daisies were their queens." Michael laughed. Michael, shaking his head. "Sounds like I had quite the imagination." "You did," Katherine said, her tone wistful. "And you still do. It's in the way you approach life, the way you carry yourself. That spirit never left you." Michael paused, looking at her. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Being your son. It's not that I don't want to, I understand." Katherine interrupted gently. "This isn't something we can rush. We'll take it one step at a time, and we'll figure it out together." Michael nodded, the sincerity in her voice easing some of his apprehension. "Okay, one step at a time, that evening, at a time." Katherine made her way to the attic, a space she hadn't visited in years. Dusty boxes lined the shelves, each one a time capsule of memories she hadn't been ready to face. With renewed determination, she opened a box labeled Ethan. Inside were more of his belongings: school projects, tiny shoes, a tattered baseball glove. Each item told a story, and Katherine couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for the years lost. But as she sifted through the items, she also felt hope. These memories, once painful reminders, now felt like seeds of something new. The next day, Katherine and Michael decided to visit the hospital where Belle had abandoned him. It was a small facility on the outskirts of the city, its modest exterior a stark contrast to the opulence of the mansion. Michael hadn't been back since he was a child, but he felt it was important to confront this part of his past. As they walked through the quiet halls, Michael couldn't help but feel a strange sense of familiarity. They spoke with the hospital administrator, who provided access to old records. Together, they found the entry. An unnamed boy, approximately 8 years old, left at the entrance by an anonymous source. Katherine read the file, her hands trembling. "This is where you were," she whispered. "This is where they left you." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But it's also where I was found. Someone took me in, someone gave me a chance." Katherine nodded, her tears falling silently. "And now, I'm bringing you home." That evening, they returned to the mansion. Both emotionally exhausted but closer than ever, Katherine led Michael to a room on the second floor. its furnishings simple but warm. "This was meant to be your room," she said. "I kept it as it was, hoping that one day you'd come back." Michael looked around, his heart heavy but full. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Katherine smiled, her eyes glistening. "This is just the beginning. Michael, we have a lifetime to catch up on." The days turned into weeks, and for the first time in years, the Reynolds mansion felt like a home rather than a monument to Katherine's grief. With David gone and the truth finally exposed, a sense of peace began to settle over the household. Yet, for both Katherine and Michael, rebuilding their relationship was a delicate process. Michael spent more time at the mansion, gradually becoming more comfortable in the space that had once felt alien to him. Katherine, in turn, found joy in reintroducing him to pieces of his past, from old family traditions to favorite recipes she hadn't made in years. One afternoon, Katherine invited Michael to the kitchen, an apron draped around her neck. "I thought we could bake something together," she said, holding up a recipe card. "Your favorite when you were little. Chocolate chip cookies." Michael raised an eyebrow, amused. "You bake?" "Not well," Katherine admitted with a laugh. "But I always made these for you. You used to call them magic cookies because you said they made everything better." Michael chuckled, tying an apron around his waist. "Let's see if the magic's still there." As they worked, Katherine recounted stories of Ethan's childhood, how he would sneak extra cookie dough when she wasn't looking, how he once declared himself the king of the cookies after a particularly successful batch. Michael listened intently, his hands busy mixing ingredients, but his mind absorbing every detail. "It's strange," he said after a while, his voice quieter, "hearing about this version of me that I don't remember." Katherine paused, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. "I know it's overwhelming, but you don't have to force anything. The memories will come, or they won't. What matters is who you are now." Michael nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I appreciate that." Meanwhile, Frank Marshall worked tirelessly to ensure David's conviction. The case against him was airtight. With James Bell's testimony and the overwhelming evidence Katherine and Frank had gathered, despite David's attempts to manipulate the narrative, the truth prevailed. One afternoon, Frank called Katherine with an update. "David's trial date is set. The day doesn't anticipate any delays." "Good," Katherine replied firmly. "He deserves to answer for what he's done." "And Bell?" she asked. "He's agreed to testify," Frank said. "I'll keep an eye on him to make sure he doesn't back out." "Thank you, Frank, for everything." Frank's voice softened. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Katherine. Not everyone would have fought this hard." Katherine hung up, her heart heavy but resolute. Justice was finally within reach, but the scars left behind by David's betrayal would take time to heal. That evening, Katherine and Michael sat in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. Michael held a glass of wine, his fingers tracing the rim as he stared into the flames. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence, "about everything. About him." Katherine didn't need to ask who he meant. "What about him?" "I spent years being angry at the people who abandoned me," Michael admitted. "And now I know it wasn't you, but it's hard not to feel cheated, like he stole so much time from us." Katherine reached over, placing her hand on his. "He did, but we can't let that anger define us. We have the time now, Michael. We have each other." Michael nodded, his gaze softening. "You're right. I just need to figure out how to let it go. We'll do it together," Katherine said. One day at a time, in the days leading up to David's trial, Katherine prepared herself for the confrontation. She knew seeing him again would be difficult, but she refused to let him intimidate her. Michael, too, insisted on attending, determined to face the man who had tried to erase him. The trial was held in a packed courtroom, the media frenzy surrounding the case adding an extra layer of tension. Katherine and Michael sat side by side, their presence a quiet but powerful statement. David, seated at the defense table, looked smaller than Katherine remembered. His once polished demeanor had been replaced with a haggard, desperate air. He avoided their gaze, but Katherine felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a grim sense of closure. James Bell's testimony was the final blow. His recounting of David's orders and his own role in Ethan's disappearance left no room for doubt. By the time the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Katherine and Michael exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's over," Michael said quietly as they left the courtroom. Katherine nodded, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. It's over. Back at the mansion, Katherine and Michael sat in the garden, the roses blooming brightly around them. The weight of the trial had lifted, leaving space for something new, hope. "What's next for you?" Katherine asked, her voice light but curious. Michael shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I don't know yet, but I think I'd like to stick around for a while. Get to know this part of me I never had before." Katherine smiled, her heart swelling. "I'd like that, more than you know." As they sat together, the sun dipping below the horizon, Katherine felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The wounds of the past would never fully heal, but with Michael by her side, she knew they could build something stronger. Together, the Reynolds mansion, once shrouded in shadows of secrets and grief, now stood as a beacon of resilience and hope. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, carried by a gentle breeze through the open windows. Katherine had spent the morning tending to the garden, her hands busy with the soil, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Inside, Michael stood in the kitchen, staring at a mug of coffee that had gone cold in his hands. His thoughts were a swirl of reflection and anticipation. The trial was over. David was gone. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a place where he truly belonged. Katherine entered, brushing dirt from her hands. She smiled when she saw him, her expression warm and inviting. "You've been quiet," she said, joining him at the table. "What's on your mind?" Michael hesitated before answering. "I've been thinking about the future, about what's next for me." Katherine nodded, her eyes searching his face. "And I don't want to leave," he said simply. "I feel like I've spent so much of my life running, from my past, from myself, but now I want to stay here with you." Katherine's eyes glistened with tears, but her smile was radiant. "You have no idea how much that means to me, Michael, or how much I've wished for this moment." Michael smiled back, a sense of calm settling over him. "I want to make up for lost time. Not just with you, but with myself. I've been trying to figure out who I am for so long. Maybe being here will help me do that." Katherine reached across the table, taking his hand. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together." Over the next few weeks, the mansion transformed into a space of joy and renewal. Katherine and Michael worked side by side to breathe new life into the house. They repainted rooms, restored old furniture, and filled the halls with laughter and music. One afternoon, Katherine led Michael to a small locked room on the third floor. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, revealing a space filled with canvases, easels, and jars of paint. "This was my studio," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I used to paint all the time, but after Ethan disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to come back here." Michael stepped inside, his eyes scanning the vibrant paintings that lined the walls. "These are incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. Katherine smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'd like to start painting again. Maybe it's time to bring some color back into my life." "I think that's a great idea," Michael said. "And maybe I can help. I used to sketch a bit when I was younger." Katherine's smile widened. "I'd love that." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Katherine and Michael sat together on the back patio, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. They shared stories, Katherine of Ethan's childhood, and Michael of his years growing up in foster care and the life he had built as an adult. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" Michael asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day," Katherine admitted. "But I've realized that wondering won't change anything. All we can do is move forward." Michael nodded, her words settling deeply in his heart. "I think I'm starting to understand that." Katherine reached over, resting her hand on his. "We can't change the past, Michael, but we have the present, and we have each other. That's enough for me." The following weekend, Katherine hosted a small gathering at the mansion, a celebration of new beginnings. Close friends and family filled the garden, the air buzzing with warmth and laughter. Katherine introduced Michael as her son, the words carrying a weight of pride and love. Throughout the evening, Michael found himself surrounded by people who embraced him with open arms. For the first time, he felt like he was truly part of something good and lasting. As the night wound down, Katherine and Michael stood side by side, watching their guests mingle under the twinkling lights strung across the garden. "This feels right," Michael said quietly. "It does," Katherine agreed, her voice filled with contentment. Michael turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you for everything." Katherine looked at him, her heart full. "I should be thanking you. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling into a place of peace. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Katherine and Michael grew stronger. They navigated the challenges of their new relationship with patience and grace, leaning on each other for support and strength. For Michael, the mansion became more than a home. It became a symbol of resilience and hope. For Katherine, it was a testament to the power of love and the strength of a mother's determination. Together, they began to create a life filled with meaning and joy, proving that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there was always the possibility of a new beginning.